Thank you. So over the past 15 years, Joe Walker and I have researched the social, emotional and cognitive factors which can underpin and improve pupil self-regulation, how you can measure and track those. We've worked across 30 schools, state and independent, day and boarding. Around about 15,000 children have been involved in our studies. We have a lot of data. Our goal behind the work that we have done has been to achieve this statement here, to help schools provide the right pupil with the right support at the right time. Now, how do we do that? Our key psychological process in order to provide that support or help schools provide that has been to improve the pupil's ability to self-regulate. So what is self-regulation? Let me use a driving analogy. Self-regulation is the ability of a pupil to socially and emotionally drive. And this involves being able to read the cues that are in front of them and to purposefully choose the appropriate response for the particular situation in hand. That's what a good driver can do physically on the road, and that's what a good socially and emotionally self-regulated pupil can do. What does that mean in practice? Well, hopefully there's lots of this good stuff going on in your schools today as we speak, children learning. But over the course of a school day, a single pupil will have to self-regulate. And in fact, it's one of the goals that you have for them. So you want, for example, your pupils to be able to stand up and take a lead and perform, but you also want them to be able to join in and take part in teams. You want your pupils to be able to join in with others and to take risks, but you also want them to be able to cope with being excluded and left out. You want your pupils to be able to struggle and work hard with their learning, but you also want them to be able to know when and how to ask for help and to reach out for it. You want your pupils to be able to cope with disappointment and setbacks, but you also want them to be able to aim and strive for success and to celebrate it when it arrives. Now, the ability of a single pupil to make all of those adjustments between those different states required to do all those different activities, that is the ability to self-regulate. So self-regulation gives, in our phrase, pupils judgement, the ability to make wise, emotionally healthy, and pro-social choices. So conversely then, poor self-regulation is an inability to do those things, and it's an indicator of limiting behaviours and of increased mental health risks. And there is a huge amount of research, and Professor Caroline Bone will speak about some of it, I think, around the risk factors of poor self-regulation. Like a car with a steering bias, a pupil with poor self-regulation has a greater risk of crashing. Crashing can look like this, developing mental health risks such as controlled eating, anxiety, overchecking, fixating, the kinds of things that Natasha was talking about just a moment ago. Social competency risks such as dominating others, social mimicry, attitudes of entitlement. Limiting learning behaviours as well, such as not being open to feedback, complacency, lack of focus, and inappropriate expectations. Now, our work has been to try to develop an assessment tool to measure the cognitive causes, not the behavioural consequences of poor self-regulation. And we use this phrase, steering, the ability of a pupil to cognitively steer, or steering cognition. Now, the key region of the brain, which is involved in the ability of pupils to regulate their steering, is the hippocampus. That little region in green there. And the hippocampus serves like our mental taxi driver. It essentially governs the way that we bias our attention and regulate our responses to the situation or the world that we find ourselves in. It chooses the most familiar and patterned routes to go down. And therefore, this is the key, because the hippocampus tends to choose the most patterned and familiar routes to go down, we can measure a pupil's current, what we call hippocampal pattern, and it will give us an indication of the future route they are likely to take. Now, this is incredibly important because it's enabling us, potentially, to get an earlier indicator of the risks of that pupil's poor self-regulation, their bias steering, their crashing, than waiting for the behavioural outcomes to actually manifest themselves. So the assessment we've developed measures, if you like, the pupil's mental taxi driver. We did a study, as I say, it's taken 15 years of work to develop this instrument, and a study we did in 2014-15 involving 3,000 pupils indicated that measuring this hippocampal pattern provided about an 82% accuracy in indicating early risks of these problems here. So we really are measuring something which is then going on to determine actual behaviours as an early indicator. Now, because we have a very large database of data from 15,000 pupils, you'll be saying to yourself, well, can't children do this assessment and can't they fake it, and you're really not going to get very good data. We're able to detect the faking patterns as well because we know what normal patterns and healthy patterns look like. And of course, we were hearing a little bit earlier from one of the former speakers about the things that structurally, institutionally, we need to be doing to create healthy schools. And one of the things that we've been trying to train schools to do is the value of good data collection. Because your data that you have is only as good as the method that you use to collect it. And so we train schools to screen all of their children twice a year on an ongoing basis in order to know whether this is improving or deteriorating. Because actually, as Natasha was saying, we're interested in mental health and well-being, not just mental illness and the point of crash. We want to know which children are well as those who are at risk. Our big goal is this, if you were to sum it up. It's to make soft data hard, Because if we're going to be able to tackle this issue of mental health risks, we have a great urgency to get better quality data than we currently do. Data that is earlier and more accurate than just measuring the pastoral car crash when it has taken place. And pastoral data, what we call typically soft data, has been dogged by a whole number of problems. And I want to just talk about some of those problems and how this hippocampal steering data can help us overcome some of them. So the first problem with pastoral data typically is that it tends to be poor quality. What I mean by that is that the best data on your children's well-being, how well they are, is to ask them and for them to tell you. However, if you ask them to write their name on the bottom of what they've written, you will get very patchy and erratic data. Therefore, the better way to get the data is to ask them anonymously. This will give you a good indication of your school culture, what's going on, but you won't be able to attribute that data to specific pupils and therefore support them individually. So we're left in this conundrum. How can we know which children are at risk? We also know that the rise in mental health problems is associated with increasingly low self-disclosure. And we heard that quite poignantly from some of the pupil voices we listened to before, where there's a great reluctance to voice when pupils feel that they are in need. Pupils typically hide their lives on social media. And if you're engaging in controlled eating and self-harm, you will do that in secret, not to be seen. So asking pupils directly is unlikely to get you the data that you need. So one of the critical benefits of measuring this hippocampal steering is that it is much less tainted by that filtering process that is going on. That's evidenced by that 82% score, that even pupils who were reluctant or unwilling to give the data, actually 82 out of 100 pupils who were screened, the pattern of their hippocampal steering gave us an accurate indication of the mental health risks, the welfare risks, whether they were being bullied, not coping with the pressure, tempted to self-harm, that was actually accurate. It's like seeing through the tinted window of the car to the actual state of the driver inside. let me give you a real story about how this data is helping some of the schools that we work with. I've changed all the names of the children I'll mention. Matthew is 13 and is always chatty and happy. However, his tutor's a bit concerned by a dark story that he's written. But when he's asked, Matthew says he's fine. But Matthew's steering data, which has been measured recently, suggests he's recently veered wildly off the road and something may not be right. So the school ask Matthew's mum if everything is okay, and it's at that point that she tells them that she's recently started treatment for cancer. How many of us have parents who do not tell us the crises and issues going on at home? 2 weeks later, Matthew swallows a handful of pills and is rushed to hospital. Matthew's steering data didn't help the school stop that, but it did forewarn that something was wrong. So the hippocampus allows us to see what is hidden. The second problem with our pastoral data is that the data we tend to get is from one context. Now, what I mean by this is that if you, for example, ask your pupils, you'll get their context, their perspective on the situation. Or perhaps if you do a parent survey about the state of their pupils, you'll get their perspective. Or if you ask the teachers around a child, you'll get each of those different classroom perspectives. So you get these isolated perspectives. But hippocampal data allows us to measure both the steering of a pupil instinctively or by default, but also in context, in school. And this is critical. It's critical because behavioural risks are contextual. They are contextual, and therefore measuring either the instinctive pattern or just the in-school pattern is not enough. If you measure both, you improve the accuracy of prediction by about 40%, which is really, really valuable. But you also do something else. You overcome this problem, which is working out what impact your school road is having on the steering of your pupils. So, in my picture, children are steering themselves, self-regulating. What impact is your school road having on your pupils' steering? Is it improving it? Is it changing it? Do they steer worse or better at home or school? And this is important as well because it enables us not just to see the cultural impact of our school, but also to resolve some of those critical dialogues that we have with parents who are reluctant to hear what we're trying to tell them about their son or their daughter. Another story, if I may. Thomas is a Year 7 pupil who's showing significant problems at school, and his parents are really not supporting staff. They don't accept that their son is disruptive and dominating and maintain that he's helpful and adaptive and collaborative. Recognise this? The school cannot solve the problems caused by this difference in perception. However, Thomas has recently had his steering data measured in both contexts, and it shows that Thomas steers very differently at home from the way he steers at school. That he dominates at school, but he doesn't at home. The school bring the parents in, show them the data, and the contradiction starts to be resolved, and the parents start to recognise how all need to work together to support Thomas. So we need to measure data, both instinctively, those default patterns, but also the effect of our school and how those two things relate or contrast to each other. And that's, again, what this hippocampal steering data can allow us to do. The third problem of pastoral data is, as we've heard already, it's available generally too late at the point of a car crash. Now, because we're measuring the cognitive causes rather than the behavioural consequences of poor self-regulation, it enables us to act earlier. Now, back in 2014, we started to detect in our data a pattern which we called, or came to call, over-regulating, an over-regulating pattern of steering. And now, this was a pattern of data indicating pupils' hypervigilance, overly self-monitoring, overly socially monitoring. Think of a new driver. Think of being, when you first learned to drive and you went out for those early drives, how effortful that was to try to sort of pay attention to all of the signs and the road signs and the behaviour of the other drivers. You got back from your first trips exhausted because you'd had to take in so much information, so much monitoring was going on. And this over-regulating pattern seems to be like that. It is this overly self and socially monitoring. And like that, driving is tiring. It is depleting. When we measure this pattern of over-regulating in pupils, it is depleting. And it's an indicator that at some point there is a heightened risk of a veering off and a crashing. Another story, Eleanor was a classic example. The perfect year 10, conscientious, high-performing, earmarked as a possible head of house. Her data indicated over several years, 18 months, that Eleanor was an over-regulator. One September, her behaviour was as normal, slightly tense and a little bit anxious, but her autumn steering data suggested that she was, in fact, cognitively crashing, even though the external signs were not yet visible. Over the course of the next year, Eleanor started to develop depression, anxiety, and self-harm disorders. The data didn't stop that, but it allowed the school to be on the front foot and to understand some of the causes behind that. It also started to help them understand how to be more vigilant when they saw this pattern in pupils, other pupils, like Eleanor, before that point. So we need to try to find data that gives us an early indicator of future risks. The fourth point about pastoral data is that even when we have it, it doesn't necessarily equip us to support our pupils and know what to do with them. We've heard quite a lot about this already this morning. At the moment, what we typically do with our pastoral care is two things. On the one hand, we provide one-to-one support for pupils who've crashed. We take them off the road into a counselling context, and we support them there. And sometimes we find ourselves feeling that whilst that's hugely supportive and beneficial, how the pupil responds and is able to behave in that kind of context is completely different than 11:30 in the morning on Monday with 11D, and how they behave in that context on the school road. So taking them off the school road isn't necessarily most helpful for helping them learn, as Natasha was saying, to behave well and in a healthy way on the school road. Secondly, we broadcast messages across the whole school. So we tell through PSHE and our various communications processes, we instruct children what good behaviour, good mental health looks like. But sometimes our broadcast messages can be counterproductive. So, for example, telling pupils to be kind, perhaps one of our school values, for a child who has a steering bias towards always allowing other people to drive all over them will only exacerbate that steering bias. Oh, I'm now being told to do this. Telling children to really focus and knuckle down at the beginning of the second half of the spring term because exams are coming will only exacerbate the child who's over-regulating and feeling hyper-anxious about that. So broadcast messaging can be hugely problematic. What we need to do is to be able to have more tailored and precise in-school signposts to support specific pupils who are starting to veer before they crash. Precise in-school signposts. That's about equipping our teachers to detect early and then in low-level supportive interventions, in just the kind of normal run of the key messages that you can give to pupils over the course of the school day to support them so that they can steer better. And this afternoon, Joe, in the session on AS tracking, will explain, and some of the schools will talk about how they've been able to do this and reduce the number of pastoral car crashes and welfare crises as a result of that. Fifthly and finally, we're nearly there, we need to know that what we do has worked. It's all very well doing our pastoral surveys and then trying to initiate things, but has it made any difference? Has it worked? We need to be able to track this capacity that we're looking to develop. And Joe this afternoon will talk about the ability to track this data regularly is enabling us to see how these little signpost changes before pupils crash can really make a difference. Some really quite startling statistics in terms of reducing the number of welfare plans being written by schools and increasing the number of children who are steering well, who are mentally have that self-agency to be able to be well. So 15 years of work, what can I leave you with today as you're thinking about how you invest in supporting your well-being, your mental health of your pupils? Invest in steering before speed. Invest in steering before speed. We did a research project a year ago where we measured what we call the width of the school road. That's the amount that children have freedom and capacity to steer as they move into different subjects and different activities, different environments. And what we found was that schools with a narrower road, adopting what we think is the government's preferred model of education, the government's motorway model of education for children to drive fast and straight and get as far along as they can. What we found was that that motorway model of education correlated with higher steering risks and higher crashes. In other words, there is a consequence of pushing children to drive faster and straighter, and it's that they are crashing more, and this is why it is happening. There's our research where you can read everything that I've said today, papers of various academic levels and more popular things. And if you're interested to hear the case studies of schools who've been tracking their pupils, then there's a session this afternoon that my colleague Joe Walker will be running. Thank you.